So we're going to talk about dry creek beds a little bit, and there's a couple of ways you can go about it. It says for drainage problems or just for the look. I like the look of dry creek beds. I think it goes back to my rearing. My Papa and Nanny lived on a farm close to a creek called Duck Creek, and that was my favorite thing to do, was go down the creek and play with the tadpoles and the minnows and stuff. And I think that's why I like the idea of a creek bed in my yard. If I can figure out a way to run water through it all the time so the grandkids would play, I definitely would do it. But I like the look of it. But I kind of got involved out of necessity. So where can you put a dry creek bed? Well, anywhere you need to move water from one place to another. Okay? It can be short, it can be long. Maybe you have an area of yard that does not drain well. I don't know about y'all's house, but my house is an older house. Lots of people have lived there. People have come in and put in flower beds, taken out flower beds, put in this, taken out this. And so it's not very level. And so as a result, you have some spots where sometimes water accumulates. You can use it around a downspout to kind of help collect that water that's running off your house and channel it out of your yard or into your yard if that's what you're interested in doing. But anywhere you've got it collecting. Or a patio that tends to flood due to poor planning by the designer. Okay? Yes, I was a designer, and that's kind of what facilitated me getting into the dry creek bed situation. So, you can also use it anywhere you think it would look nice. Maybe you want a focal point for your yard. You're just tired of mowing that yard, and you'd like to take a little bit of the lawn out, and that looks like a good idea. You put some planting beds around it. You can use it to divide planting beds from turf. I personally have Bermuda grass, and keeping my Bermuda grass out of my flower beds is a huge undertaking. But if you put a dry creek bed along, and that gives you a nice wide edging, and then you can hit it with, you know, your horticultural vinegar or your Roundup or whatever you happen to use to help keep the grass and weeds out of your flower bed. You can use rocks that you've collected. I'm a rock hound from way back. And so when we moved my mom in, my dad was also a rock collector, so we had a lot of stuff from their yard, and so I was able to incorporate that into my dry creek bed. It also can give the illusion of water, and I'm going to show you some pictures here in a little while that kind of does that even more than just having the creek bed there. So this is a dry creek bed that I'm actually working on right now at the National Wasp Museum. When I came in to help, let's see if I got it, yeah. This was just a gully. And the director of the museum said she'd really like to do some plantings that would soften things up. The original landscaping was pretty much yuccas, cactus, and rocks. She wanted something that was a little bit different. And she said, we had some stuff planted in here, but I don't know, it just died. I said, okay. So I kept watching this, and I knew we were going to have to do something. So I took some of the rock that was there, and I kind of created this dry creek bed. And then I started digging up and planting a few plants in here. And one of the things that I found was that there were plants there. They were dead, and they were covered up with silt because water coming off this massive hanger washed through there and just covered them up, literally. So even after doing this, we still have some issues. You can see here, we've got some drainage here and some drainage here. So I'm in the process of doing a little bit of terracing to kind of slow that water down, but it's definitely better than what it was. It's not washing my plants out. And so this is a good example of how to do this, because there's lots and lots of water coming off here. Now I've had to finagle with it a little bit. When I first put it in, the part up here wasn't wide enough to catch all the water I needed it to. So I had to go back and experiment a little bit. And that's part of the process of putting in a dry creek bed. Sometimes you have to tweak it a little bit and work on it a little bit. So this is my dry creek bed. And what's unusual about mine, and I don't have a lot of good pictures of it. When I was building it, I wasn't anticipating doing a PowerPoint, or I would have done a better job of taking pictures. But I have a patio that we put in. We had a slab back porch that was original to the house. We wanted to extend it. It wasn't very big. And so we put in a paper patio. I had some planting beds in that area already, and I didn't want to try to dig up any trees or any shrubs. I wanted to leave them there, but in order to get it level with the existing slab, I had to dig down. So I ended up with kind of a sunken patio with flower beds on two sides. And first time we got a good heavy rain, you know exactly what happened. It collected on that paper patio, and when it started to fill up, it then started moving up onto my porch. So my husband said, we're going to have to do something about that. He had tried to convince me I needed to take out those planting beds. I said, no, it'll be fine. It'll look nice. Like, yeah, he was right. So my dry creek bed is kind of unusual in that I have an opening here that runs all the way across that paper patio I've dug out, filled with gravel, and that's kind of the mouth of my dry creek bed. It runs back here. Now at this time I had a shed that was kind of in a low spot in the backyard, and so I just funneled that right back behind these shrubs here and underneath that shed. Shed set up pretty high, and so it wasn't a problem. And then if it was a lot of water, it'd go on out into the alley. Now we've taken the shed out, we put in an above ground swimming pool, not a big one, but a little one. And so I've taken and redirected the creek back over this direction, and now it empties out into my yard. The lawn's not real big, so it gives me a lot of water to help with the grass. So here's some other examples of some dry creek beds that I thought were really nice. This one, you can see the downspout right here. It's not very long. It's just taking that water out here into the grass and keeping it from flooding, I'm sure, back in this corner up against the foundation. This one's probably more for looks than anything, though it may be funneling some water as well. This one's pulling water off the sidewalk and taking it back down this hill. This one is another one I think may be for looks, so it's kind of hard to tell. There may be a downspout back here, and it could move the water down this direction. I like the use of the driftwood there. It's nice. So there's some pros and cons about dry creek beds. Pros, it doesn't take much of a slope to get water moving. This is an important thing. When you start digging, you don't have to dig all that deep. All you have to do is make sure one end is higher than the other. You don't need a lot of heavy equipment. I've read some articles about you need a backhoe, you need a skid steer. No. A shovel will do it. If you've got some cheap labor, children, grandchildren, that kind of stuff, that helps too. But really, you don't have to do that much digging. Most of the things that you're going to need are pretty affordable, and the equipment you probably have at your house as far as that's concerned. You can always, if you're working on a budget, I am always working on a budget, there are some things that you can do a little bit differently in order to cut down on the cost. Depending on the size of your dry creek bed, it can be done in a weekend. If you're talking about a regular yard here in town, you're probably not going to have to dig a very long creek bed. Now, if you're out in the country and you're trying to divert water into, say, a tank or a pond or whatever, and you have to have a longer area, it may take you a little bit longer. I worked on mine for kind of off and on probably 2 weeks. But I did it in late fall, early winter, so I was teaching, and so I'd work on a little bit on the weekends pretty much. And I tend to take lots of breaks, so it took me a little while longer. So some of the cons. It may not work for large amounts of water right up next to your house. So if you have your house situated at the bottom of a large hill, dry creek bed is probably not going to cut it. You're probably going to need a French drain and some other things and someone professional to come in and see about all that stuff. But if you're talking about, a regular amount of water coming off your house, probably a dry creek bed will work for you. It does require digging. That's really the main labor, that and moving some rocks. You'll need rocks, lots of rocks, lots of rocks. And the size of the rocks can vary. I started out with relatively small rocks. I did buy a few larger rocks later on, and luckily I still have a son living at home who was a power lifter, so, he did that. I did not. So when you're planning your creek bed, you do need to kind of plan some things out ahead of time. First is, where's it going to start? Now that may be easy. You may have a downspout, exactly where it's going to start. With me, that's where it was. I needed to start along this patio and move the water out. So wherever the water's coming from is where you're going to start. The point may need to be fairly wide if it's not a downspout like mine is, or it could be very narrow. Where is it going to go? Now this is a little tougher. Do you need it to go off the property? Do you need it to go into your lawn? Do you want to funnel it into a planting bed? You know, how do you want to do that? You want to put it in a rain garden. We're going to talk about rain gardens a little bit. One of the things that you need to be aware of, I don't know what the ordinances are here in Abilene, but in most cities it's illegal to funnel water off of your property onto somebody else's private property. So if you're funneling it into the street, we use our streets as storm drains, so that's not a big deal. But you don't want to funnel it onto your neighbor's property and cause them a problem. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about where that's going to head out. You need to figure out what route it's going to take. You can follow the path of the natural path of the water in some cases. That's pretty much what I did. I just wanted it to drain faster. Remember that creeks tend to meander, so you don't want it to be straight. You want it to have some curves. They don't have to be significant curves. They can be very sloping curves. That's what mine has. But the curves help to slow down the water, especially if you're moving quite a bit of water fairly quickly. If it's coming out of a downspout, it may help to have a few curves, slow that water down a little bit so it doesn't wash out the creek bed too. Don't forget to check for utility lines before you dig. Okay? You're probably not going to dig down to the utility lines, but hey, make sure you know where they are just in case. All right? So what are you going to need? Well, shovel. There's that digging I was talking about. Now, if you've got a skid steer, that's great, you know, but I don't, so shovel's it. Spray paint to mark the path. Now, I didn't actually use spray paint. I have a hoe with a point on it, and I just kind of etched through the grass and kind of figured out how I wanted it, and that's kind of the way I did it. I'm too cheap to buy paint. A tamper to pack down the soil in the bottom of the creek bed. I had, again, a son who went out there and stomped it down pretty good. Got the grandkids out there and stomped it down pretty good. And I have pretty heavy clay soil in this particular place, so it tamped down pretty easy. Landscape fabric, this will prevent the rocks from disappearing into the soil. You'll probably need a utility knife or a pair of scissors to cut it. I really do recommend using the landscape fabric. That was really the only expense I was really willing to go to, because here where we are, that's exactly what's going to happen. The rocks are just going to disappear down into the ground. You need that to kind of form a barrier. It's not really going to stop the weeds. It will at first, but eventually what's going to happen is enough dirt's going to wash in on top of that fabric that the weeds start growing on top of it. That's what happens in most places where you use landscape fabric. Eventually there's enough dirt on top of it that weeds can take hold. So it never stops weeds forever, just for a little while. You're going to need rocks of various sizes. In my case, I was really lucky. I had some rocks that I liked. I had a friend who had bought a new house that had a rock garden. She didn't want those rocks, so we removed them. And I had another friend who lives out in the country, and they had a pile of rocks from plowing. They pulled up some pretty decent sized rocks and just kind of stuck them in a spot. And since we were working in the fall and winter, we went out and got some rocks that we could make. But you can get them from the rock yard. Maybe you've got, again, a friend who needs to get rid of some. Check online garage sales. Lots of times people will buy a pallet of landscape rock, especially if they're pretty good size, and they may not use all of them. Sometimes you'll find people dug stuff up from the field and they want to sell it. They just want someone to haul it off, really. But sometimes you can get some rock pretty inexpensively, just checking online and seeing what's out there. If you have cheap labor, that's always good. Like I said, I have a son, had a husband, grandkid. He wasn't a very big grandkid, but he could move little rocks and stuff like that. So, find some neighborhood kids who need a little extra money for school or whatever. See what you can find. Okay, so this kind of gives you an overview of kind of how this is going to work. You're going to plot a natural curving course down your slope. You're going to lay down your landscape fabric. Now notice that the landscape fabric comes up here. You'll dig out you put your dirt out here. When you've got your landscape fabric where you want it, then you put some of that dirt back on top to help hold it down and to build up your bank to keep it from the water from washing out into your yard if it gets full. Pile excavated dirt along the sides to accentuate the trench. Keep the flattest, heaviest stones for the first course or capstones. Now that's if you have a specific point of origin. So if you've got a downspout, you put some big rocks there to kind of signify this is the start of it. With my creek bed, I just have gravel at the beginning because it's coming off in kind of a big sheet. And so I have most of my larger rocks kind of scattered down the side. Let's see, where are we? Use small rocks in the creek bed and large rocks along the side. Use large boulder or plants to make headwaters more interesting. I didn't really do that because of my situation. But if you're doing it out, like I said, from a downspout or something, that works real well. So once you've marked out your path with spray paint, or in my case, etched it out on the grass, you're going to start your digging. Remember, the trench has to get deeper as you go along. It doesn't take much slope to move water. So start pretty shallow, you can always go back and remove more. And I started out too deep to start with. And then I realized I was having to dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and so I went back and I filled in a little bit at the front. And I did decide in a couple of spots to dig a little deeper than I originally had. But I would say when you're starting it, don't start the top end of it too deep. Most of the things that I read said 12 to 18 inches. I don't know if that's the start or the end, but I didn't do 12 to 18 inches. I did probably 4 inches, maybe, at the top part, and probably by the time I got down to the end of it, it might have been 8 inches at that point. It's not very deep, but it does not massively move that water. I'm not trying to get it off all at once. I just want it to drain within an hour, and that's pretty much what it does. Pile the dirt a little back of the bank so that you can get your landscape fabric out, and then you can move it back onto it. Once you've dug it out like you want it, tamp down the dirt in the bottom. So put your landscape fabric down. This is going to help to suppress weeds, prevent the rocks from sinking in. Don't use plastic. Plastic is going to start to disintegrate and it's going to make a mess. Landscape fabric will too. It's just going to take a lot longer, and so you have less to clean up at one time. I've had mine where the landscape fabric is starting to kind of come loose, and so I've trimmed it back and that kind of stuff. Because at this point, it's not really, all it's doing is keeping the rocks from sinking down. It's not doing a whole lot of otherwise. It's certainly not suppressing weeds. Use as good a landscape fabric as you can afford. The heavier it is, the better it's going to work in the beginning. I think in the long run, though, it's all going to do the same thing. I think if you do a heavier landscape fabric to begin with, it's probably going to just last longer. But whatever works for you. Now, you could use cardboard down on the bottom, but that's going to disintegrate pretty quickly. You want to cover the bottom and sides of the creek plus a good 12 inches on either side. And I would say that I did about definitely at least 12 inches, probably a little bit more. You can use landscape staples to hold the landscape fabric in place. I just use rocks. Again, cheap. I just put some big rocks and held it down with that, and that worked pretty well. So rock placement. Okay, place your largest rocks first. To make it look natural, you're going to place your largest stones at the curves of the bed. So when water is moving in a natural setting, if there's a big rock, that water hits that rock and then goes around it. So you end up with a curve, and it kind of washes out on this side, and then it'll go back until it hits another rock. So if you've got a couple of good-sized rocks, that's kind of, you want to put them in the curve. That's going to look natural, where if the curve comes out. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm explaining that well. I kept looking for a picture I could use, and it didn't work very well. Okay, if you have enough larger rocks, you can group some together. Next, add your medium-sized rocks along the side. Smaller river rocks will go mostly in the bed itself. And then to save on river rock, you can fill in bare spots with pea gravel. Pea gravel is pretty inexpensive. Okay. Now when I did mine, if you remember that picture, I used a lot of pea gravel because it was cheap. And then I used the rocks that I had gotten from my friends to do along the sides and so on and so forth. One of the problems with pea gravel is it washes. If you get a good run of water, it's going to wash. So I spend a lot of time, usually in the spring, I go out and I kind of rake out the leaves and stuff that's gathered. And then I spend a lot of time kicking the pea gravel back up on the sides, okay? Or I get a rake and I rake it up. And to me, that's not that big a deal. But I think I am going to invest in some more river rock. At this point, I feel like I've got enough money invested. I can spend a little bit more money on it and see if I can't help to hold that pea gravel in place. But it definitely works if you are wanting to fill in just a few little bare spots. Okay, so I've just got some pictures of some different ones I thought really looked nice, and I wanted to show you. So this one, you can see they've done a little bridge over here. It looks like this is probably a gully along the street, and so they've rocked it in so it looks nice, and then they've landscaped around it. I just like the flowers in this one. But you can see they've got some pretty good sized rocks. This one, not so much. I mean, they've got one big one down here. I'm not even sure that's on the same property. But most of those rocks are not huge. This one is a side yard, and they actually put stepping stones in the middle. So when it's not raining, it's packed, which I thought was pretty smart. This one is they're using it to separate the lawn. And they've got some pretty good sized rocks there, and then they put the river rocks in the middle. Here's one under a downspout. You can see how they've even put some plants in there. Here again, you've got some big rocks, but most of those rocks are relatively small. Now these are the ones that give you the feeling or the illusion of water. This is purely decorative. They put a big pot up there. They put some white river rock. They threw out some blue glass. And this is probably tumbled glass, recycled glass. And it gives you the illusion of water coming down the hill. Here they've done all glass. It's stylized. It's not very natural looking, but it's kind of cool. This one I love. If I had the patience to do that, I would. I do not have the patience to do that. But if I did, that is really cool. I would love to do that, but I don't have that kind of patience. I would get bored with that pretty quick. Okay, so one of the options for where you can have your dry creek bed going is into a rain garden. Okay, we have a rain garden out in front of the building in one of our demonstration gardens, and basically, there we go. It's a depression that's 6 to 9 inches deep, filled with plants that can tolerate occasional flooding. So the idea is the water can collect in this low spot and soak in. You use plants that can handle occasionally being flooded. Surprisingly, there's quite a few plants that will fall into that category. And then it'll allow the water to soak in and go back into the ground, to the groundwater. And so this one, I just found this picture online. And it's got some different plants, some cone flowers, asters, foxglove, daylilies, all sorts of stuff. I think out in our garden we have some cone flowers, and we have some salvia. Who worked on that? Who knows some more things that we have out there?
Ruella, down in the bed of Ruella.
Yeah.
We have a east necklace tree. It's one of the plants.
So there's a lot of different things that you can put in there to take up the space. During heavy rains, water collects in the garden, it filters back into the ground, and that's what we want to do. We want to keep that water in the ground as much as you can. This is a photograph of one, and you can see the creek bed itself is not very long, and then they have set up this rain garden here with, I don't know even, I know there's liatris. I can't tell what the other stuff is. Now, normally what I would do at this point is I would have a whole bunch of sources that I used. Mainly my sources were Google and Pinterest. I just looked for pictures and some information. So if you're wanting some more detailed information, just Google dry creek beds or dry river beds. You'll find lots and lots of information. But again, just keep in mind, lots of times when they're giving you these instructions, they're talking about using lots more equipment. They're talking about using lots and lots of big rocks. They're talking about digging big ditches. You don't have to necessarily do that. You can keep it pretty shallow. I started out, I'm gonna go back, maybe see if I can get back to mine. I didn't have a lot of big rocks. I had lots of medium-sized and smaller rocks. I'll get there in a minute. I should have put it at the end. So you can see most of these rocks are not very large. I had some stepping stones that I, again, got from a friend who got rid of a stepping stone patio, and I used one for a little bridge down here. But most of these are relatively small rocks. I did go and buy a couple of slightly bigger rocks, and big enough that my grandsons can climb on. And I put them out. And then later on I bought some other rocks to use in my front yard for a very specific purpose and had a few left over, and so I put a few more in. But you don't have to have lots of big rocks. You can always add one later on if you find one or someone has one to give you or something along those lines. You can use relatively small rocks in order to do that. Okay? So anybody have any questions? Nada? I'm hearing crickets. Okay. In that case, we will end that. Yes, ma'am.
So I know that snakes like on rocks and stuff like that. Do you think this would attract them?
I think it's going to depend on where you live. I have had a few snakes, but they're all been grass snakes and garden snakes. And I really haven't had a lot. I think we are very cautious at the museum out at Sweetwater about how we use rocks and large rocks and things like that, because it's the rattlesnake capital of the world, and we do have snakes. We find them around. We're out on the edge of town, so that's just one of those things that you kind of deal with. And so one of the things that I have tried to do is kind of limit the really big rocks that we use. Try to use small. That doesn't mean I won't get a snake in the small rocks, but it's harder for them to hide under. Yes, sir?
Yeah, with that, if you get a pile of rocks, that will attract the rodents. The rodents will attract the snakes.
Yeah.
So if you don't have any space for rodents in your stuff, it should be all right.
Yeah. So that's another thing. I didn't pile rocks really, really tall. Even at the museum, the rocks are not real deep. So there's not a lot of crevices or places for bigger snakes to get. I'm sure some smaller. I have some lizards that run around out there. I will say this. I have had some black widows. I had one in my backyard. Well, I've had it off and on in my backyard. I don't use a lot of pesticides. I'm really big on kind of nature taking its own course. And so on occasion I do find one. We did find one in the rocks at the museum, which just reminded me to always wear gloves. But it's not like the place was infested with them. It was one. I was seeing lots of dead bugs. I figured there was something in there getting them, and that was what it was. The one in the backyard was up underneath a rock, and there was a little bit of a divot in there. And so after I just dispatched her, I went in and filled it with some more rocks, so there's not as much room for them. But I mean, I'm aware. I try to be aware of things in my yard. But I'm in town. I'm not saying I can't get a rattlesnake in town, because we do. But I have so many cats in our neighborhood, I don't think it's really a problem. I found more dead snakes in my yard from the dogs. Usually if there's one there, they get it. But in the country, I would try to be aware of it, but haven't had a specific problem. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to turn it back to Kathy.